Yes, certainly. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to what's going to be, I think, a very important moment in the history of CTS, as well as a very important moment in terms of theological education's engagement with the transformational power of faith in the world. So our symposium today is one that allows us to engage the deep, rich legacy of Reverend Jesse L. Jackson and his work in terms of bringing about social change and cultural transformation using the language and power of religion. And when I say religion, I don't only mean his Christian faith, but I mean the very deep commitment that he has to American civil religion. So the best ideas that come from the scriptures of our tradition that we call the Bible, but also that come from our national traditions that we call the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. All of these are of a cloth. And what the cloth is one that tries to guide a way for America to live into its promise. America to live into what were the dreams of those who were the founders, even though the dreams were far larger and certainly better than the men who had them. It doesn't mean then that the dreams themselves are not something worthy of aspiration. So today we have an opportunity to engage the thoughts of one who has drawn deeply from all of those wells and to have some commentators share with us in that. And as we do this, we are certainly very happy as a part of the work of CT, not only sponsor this conversation, but hopefully engage people in an ongoing conversation that will spark new interest and new engagement. So with that, I will just say thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Ray.
Thank you and welcome to our Jesse Jackson online mini-symposium. We are grateful for your presence this morning. My name is Reverend Brian Smith. I am Director of Advancement and Strategic Partnerships here at the Chicago Theological Seminary. And we are very grateful for your presence as we celebrate Juneteenth this morning. Juneteenth, for you who don't know, is the day when enslaved Black people finally received the news of the Emancipation Proclamation, some 2 years after it was actually announced. And so today we celebrate freedom. Even in the midst of challenges and turmoil, we celebrate and we speak freedom. We have a distinguished panel of speakers this morning. I will allow them when they have the opportunity to introduce themselves to you, but we have two sons of Chicago Theological Seminary. As you have heard, Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. and Reverend David Wallace. Together, both of them started the Chicago branch of the Breadbasket movement. We're very grateful for them. We have our own Reverend Dr. Joanne Terrell. We will be joined by Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson, and we will be led throughout the process by Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks. Reverend Dr. Otis Moss Jr. may be able to attend later, and Reverend Martin Deppy sends his love and blessings to us. He had some health challenges and he is unable to attend today, but we're very grateful for this opportunity and we celebrate it. And we ask you to join us as we move into our quest of knowledge and greater awareness of the freedom movement. Let us pray. Mighty and loving God, we still ourselves. We gather this morning as we celebrate freedom. Freedom of Black people, freedom of all people. We recognize that you give us life and you give us life more abundantly. And so we celebrate and we fight for the life that you have freely given us. Lord, we pray your blessings upon this gathering. Bless all those who are assembled here today. Touch our hearts, touch our minds so that we might be receptive to your move. Lord, we acknowledge all of the many ways that you are acknowledged, and even those who may not have a faith tradition. And Lord, I pray in the name of the one who calls me, as I pray in the name of Jesus. And together we all say, amen.
Amen.
So now I believe Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks is present with us. We invite you to go into the top right-hand corner of your screen and tap on the speaker view icon to enable you to see the individuals that are speaking at the present moment. And so we're going to begin with a brief plenary that will be led by Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. and Reverend Dr. Aubrey Hendricks. And so I ask you to receive them now.
All righty. So how will we proceed? Reverend Jackson?
Over, if there's any such thing, I need you to buy 6 minutes. I'm leaving my third, but I'll be at my,
Reverend, we lost you there. Reverend Jackson?
He muted his phone.
Okay. Well, now I'll begin. It's so nice to see everybody gathered here today.
we're all mute now, right?
Yes, sir.
I'm about 4 minutes away from the screen.
Okay, Dr. Hendricks will speak until you arrive, Reverend.
Yes, sir.
Okay. No, it's good to see everybody today. Well,
Thank you, Mrs.
muted, Reverend. Okay. I'll tell you, this has been very trying, these days of Zoom meetings for those of us who aren't from the Zoom generation. But we're Zooming in as best we can. So nice for everybody to join us today to talk about a very important subject. One that I think needs much more attention, and that is the career of Reverend Jesse Jackson and his contributions to the life of our nation, and contributions that have really touched the lives of probably all of us to some extent living today. Reverend Jesse Jackson is not only perhaps second in note to Martin Luther King among notable Black figures in the 20th and 21st century, but certainly I suggest that he's one of the most notable of all Americans in the political history, social and political history of this nation. Americans are familiar with his extraordinary career and his impact on our social fabric. He has been ubiquitous in our lives, and he's been on the forefront of so many important activisms and events. But his career is not really known as deeply as one would think. Most of what's known are his public activities, but the strategic nuances, the planning and strategic calculations that went into every step of his political activities, they're really models of political and social activism. And the study of it would benefit today's activists very greatly. But when I talk about Reverend Jesse Jackson, you know that I didn't just call him a civil rights leader, because although he does belong way up in the pantheon of important civil rights figures in this nation's history, he has been more than a civil rights leader. Less well known, and I guess just as important in their own right, are his contributions in the areas of economic and foreign policy and international activism. And I'd like just to give some sense of why this discussion of Reverend Jackson is so important today, by taking a moment or two to focus on his international activism, which is an area of his activism and his thought that's not well known at all. Just to give you an example of the importance, the worldwide, the international import and influence he has had. I'm going to give a couple of thumbnails. I'm going to go down the list. In 1983, he traveled to Syria to secure the release of a captured American pilot. Some of you might recall Navy Lieutenant Robert Goodman, who was held by the Syrian government. And after Jackson made a dramatic personal appeal to Syrian President Hafiz Assad, Goodman was released. The Reverend Jackson told me about that meeting and how we talked to Assad. And it was fascinating. He was talking to him. He said, like he was talking to a brother on the street. And but I mentioned this also because this is one of the most momentous, one of the most important, influential moments I had with Reverend Jesse Jackson. You might recall that when he brought Goodman back from Syria, prior to that, the United States government had tried, President Reagan had tried, everyone had failed. Jesse Jackson brought him back. Yet they did not want to give him credit for what he had done. And so he, though they couldn't ignore him. So in the Rose Garden, President Reagan gave a speech, and Goodman was there, Reverend Jackson was there. And so Reagan acknowledged Reverend Jackson, but he wasn't going to let him steal his thunder and get any media attention. He stepped away from the mic, and one of the biggest coups that I've ever seen occurred at that point. Reverend Jesse Jackson bogarted the microphone from the President of the United States and spoke to Black America. And for me, that was one of the most courageous and inspiring acts. So many young people were inspired by that. But also, he went to Cuba and got the release of 22 Americans from Fidel Castro when no one else could. On the eve of the Persian Gulf War, Reverend Jackson made a trip to Iraq to negotiate with Saddam Hussein for the release of foreign nationals that he was holding as a human shield in the first Iraq War. And of course, he was successful. In 1997, he traveled to Kenya to meet with President Daniel Arap Moi as a special envoy to promote free and fair elections. In 1999, he went to the Kosovo War, went to Belgrade to negotiate with Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic for the release of 3 U.S. POWs that had been captured there. Those 3 men were released to Reverend Jackson's custody. In 2003, he spoke to over an estimated 1 million people in Hyde Park, London, as a culmination of the anti-war demonstration there. He spoke to activists in Northern Ireland to help negotiate a more peaceful situation there. He even traveled to Venezuela to meet with Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez after televangelist Pat Robertson had made a remark that implied that Chavez should be assassinated. Reverend Jackson has been on the forefront of so much domestic change, we know, but as I just noted, he has had an international influence. I traveled with him to Gambia a few years ago, and when we arrived there, we were 2 hours late. Yet the whole cabinet of the president's cabinet was there waiting for him, including the Chief Justice. There was a state dinner, and all over the television the whole time we were there, Jesse Jackson is here in Africa. And so I've mentioned that just to give a sense that what we're talking about is not just a civil rights activist, not just a son of the United States, but one of international stature. And that's why we're going to talk about him today. And that's why he is so deserving of our attention and much more attention and study in time to come. Thank you, Brother Smith.
Reverend, are you present?
Let me express my thanks to you. I'm about to get ready to roll in a minute here. The role of CTS in my life. I think I was in the sit-in to use the public library in Greenville, South Carolina, July 16, 1960. It'll be 60 years, July 16th this year. So I used the public library. I came home from college and had to go to the colored library. Didn't have enough books, sent me to the main library, and I was refused. I was determined that summer to sit in Greenville. I was active in church, Springfield Baptist Church. And I went back to school. I went to the public library, and the lady said, I had books for you in 7 days. I said, I need them. It's my first trip home for Christmas. I need the books. And I said, there's 2 of us in the library. So I'll go into stacks. I learned the term stacks at the University of Illinois. And the police said, you heard what she said. And I got the point. I thought they were there, they'd been friendly with her, but she called them because Miss Smith thought I was coming to the library. And I was resolved. And I cried in the back. I had to go back out the back door. That some of my classrooms are having the same experience. And so several things happened at the same time. Number one, that same fall, Jackie Robinson had come to Greenville, South Carolina, to do a state NAACP banquet. And he went to leave the airport with Reverend Mrs. James Hall. And she said, well, it was clean in the white section. The lady said, you'll have to leave. She said, I'm not leaving. So, there's so many people came there but see Jackie Robinson off until out of the detention, Jackie said, I'll come back and we'll have a protest. January the 1st of 1960, Reverend James Hall led a demonstration of 1,500 people in Greenville. Maybe the biggest demonstration South Carolina ever heard at that time. Opened up the airport. I came home that summer and went to Springfield, 7 of my classmates and I. We determined we go to the public library. We test the library. And we went through the process of preparation, discipline involved. And we were processed. Something happened to me that day in jail. At jail, I lost my fear of jails and death. It was astonishing to meet my father, who I learned much of my protests from. I came home from the library, jail, feeling good about what we had done. Dad said, do you have any meals that you're missing? I said, no, Dad. He said, you're down there sitting in and stuff, you're gonna get in trouble. And they might come bomb our house and your mother doing a hand beauty shop next door. So we have our little confrontation, Dad and I did. And so that was the beginning of it for me, the activism. The Greens were dogs on A&T that fall. I left Illinois, went to A&T. And in 62, I guess, 63, I guess it was, in the Greensboro movement, I was inclined to go to law school because I had seen lawyers fight back, Reverend Attorney Sampson and Smith in Greenville. Dr. Proctor said, the seminary is a broad education. The law, I cannot imagine a preacher having a broad education than a lawyer. I couldn't imagine that at that time. So he had Dr. Dean Moore from CTS on campus. I had really been set up by Dr. Proctor and A. Knight and Stanley. And I was offered a Rockefeller Scholarship for CTS. I met Jay Wallace and Gary Masoni, who got to say, I think the difference is, Reverend Hendricks, I went to CTS, Jesus was in my pocket. Jesus was following me around. I left CTS following Jesus. I took him out of my pocket. I took him out of my culture, out of my understanding. And so I found him around the world. Wherever I went, I was at home. Many we're locked into cultural limitations, the culture of Christ. He's in our pocket. Jesus does what we say do, go what we say go. To follow him is the Great Commission, and that's kind of what drove me. Now, NAACP, the Council of Greenville, Core, Jim Farmer in Greensboro. We'll talk about it in more detail later. And then Dr. King in 1965. And the rest of my career is better known. I'm delighted to be a part of this session today because I've learned a few lessons. One of them is that take Jesus at your pocket and follow him. Next big lesson, Dr. King said, we live in our faith, we live under the law, our faith. You have lots of faith, but on the front of the bus says, color from the real, white from the front. You have to have the power for your faith to deal with law. People of faith change law. People of faith change law. And that's our constant challenge. How do we can adjust to unjust law. We can't resent it, we have to resist it. And that's kind of the philosophical reason of my activism, resisting unjust law. That's risky. That's what gets you jailed, gets you blasted, gets you killed. Our mission is to take the illness of our situation where we're born and fight for just law. And that's been my mission.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Reverend. We have seen that, and it has. We've seen it play out on multiple fronts, not only domestic policy, but foreign policy, economic policy, and that's why we're going to talk about you and the breadth of your activism today. I'd like to say that you have been an important inspiration to me. And I think one of the things that Dr. King said that one of his regrets was that he was so busy with activism, he didn't have a chance to put down and codify the depth of his philosophy. And I think that's some of what, listening to you talk and reflecting on your career, that's some of what needs to be done in these coming years. But what you share with us, this gem, which is so very, very important here, and that is the basis of our activism as people of faith, has to be the model of activism and courageous activism, strategic activism that Jesus gave us and modeled for us, and that the watchword must be justice and resistance for justice.
If you call it mindless materialism, you can't get there. It's Rich Young Ruler's problem. If you are without courage, you can't. Many people have intellect. They see the water, they won't put the foot in the water. With the intellect, you have to know what the water is, but you have to go to the edge. It takes courage. And Paul said, faith, hope, and love are these three great moral imperatives. I think he missed courage. Faith, hope, and love. You don't have courage, you won't get the water. You explain why the water's too cold, too many shocks. You don't know whether you have to have courage to take on the water. Yeah. That's the dimension. It seems to me that it's all missing.
Yeah. And it's funny you said, I've been reflecting on that. That is one of the also important lessons, I think, of your life. Without getting too far afield, let me say this. I reflected on what made this young man from Greenville, South Carolina, who had the challenges growing up that you have shared numerous times in your autobiography, some very painful challenges you had growing up. What gave this young man, this young boy that grew into this young man, the courage and the self-possession and belief that he could go around the world and talk to any world leader that there was, each as peers, and at times even being intimidating to some. What made Jesse Jackson into the man that he became, coming from where he came from, that he could go and look eye to eye at Fidel Castro, who stared down and frightened half the leaders of the world. I think so. This mention of courage, I think that's something that needs to be plumbed in psychological terms, but also in social terms, but also in terms of in faith commitment terms, as you mentioned. And that's why it's so fascinating to have this talk today, and the many that should come after, to look at the very dimensions, the various dimensions of your life, of course, your activism, and your inspiring model for us today, and for what young activists can learn from you today.
Well, somewhere in that we speak of unity, but the Bible's vision, higher person of unity is vision. If you have 1,000 blind people, one-eyed person's in charge. You have to see it, and once you see it, then you have to have the courage to go for it.
Yeah.
And so, my time is like during this season. We'll talk more about this season now. Does one see what's happening now? When these forces converge on us, the perfect storm of racial antagonism by the police, the COVID-19, the epidemic of poverty, and a hostile president. Many people, it seems to me, are fighting the police issue, the kind of visible enemy, and taking the risk of not dealing with COVID-19. I think some of these spikes in the virus is coming from people who were violating the protocols. They're not doing the distancing. They are grouping up because of fascination with being together on a great mission, and they are not doing the hand sanitation thing. And I think we will pay a price for that. But my division, as I see it, is the police is just the epidermis of the problem. They're the outer layer. Police are public workers, lower middle class workers, who police patrol. They don't control. The force we must fight are those who control. Police are enslaved. They were the slave patrols. They didn't own the plantation. They didn't set trade policy for cotton. They just patrol. And often a poor man with a gun and a badge, the salary can be awfully mean to people. And whenever we've had these rebellions, whether Detroit or LA, Watts, Chicago, or Newark, it's been when some police humiliated us. We chose to fight back. But when you get through fighting back in Newark, who controls the trade market at Newark? When you do fighting back, who controls? The banks do the lending and the investing. Insurance companies do the redlining. If every police was nice today, there's a health disparity, education disparity, wage disparity, wealth disparity. These disparities that they were facing are the real challenges. So if you get through with the police, you're not there with Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Right here, guys. Hello.
Reverend, hard time hearing you. Someone needs to mute. Reverend?
I believe he's switching devices and going into the visual, so he needs to turn off one. That's what's happening.
Did you hear me now?
There you are. We got you. We got you. We're getting ready to pivot to the next section of the program, but
yeah, I'm simply saying in the vision thing, people who are marching, because the rules are different. I'm saying that effort and excellence means a lot, and inheritance and access means more. And the rules of inheritance and access, the laws of perpetuity, we have a big issue in fighting the police. They're out of control. They have these laws to protect them from their responsibilities to the people. So I'm afraid that with all the focus on the police, ignoring COVID-19, that's a risk. And the fact if we end the fact, how can I put this over? How can I put this? People who are freedom allies may not be our equality allies. There's white so marching us because police brutality embarrasses them. It embarrasses the white narrative of themselves being good people. So they're embarrassed by it. We're humiliated by it. The difference in this killing of George Floyd was the camera. We were aware of that in a constant sense. And that concerns me very much. And so I'm concerned that how do we see it, be able to articulate and have the courage. Now, where the politics come in, the courage to be people, and the Ronald Niebuhr comes in, and the Over Hendricks comes in, people who, scholars who've thought this thing through in detail. I've tried to follow, in some sense, the courage to be, and tried to follow Ronald Nature, Destiny, Man, and lately the guy who drives my consciousness. But Jesus is Dr. Over Hendricks. I'm glad you're here today, Doctor. I'm delighted to be a part of this session, to learn from it. Dave Wallace, brother beloved, we came to Chicago in 1964 in the fall of that year, and David Garales and my son and two young white friends were at the back. We were emptying our luggage together, trying to learn how to do black and white stuff together. We became close friends, and I'm sure we'll get into it in more detail later.
Yeah.
My concern over is that we all of our energies on police. We're dealing with those who control. We're not dealing with those who control.
Yeah.
The banks and the Silicon Valleys.
Well, we're going to get into that, Reverend. As we get into our dialogue, I just like to say that just in this couple minutes, you have given us yet again reason to recall and to acknowledge the brilliance of analysis that you have brought to this struggle, and to continue to bring the struggle. And these few minutes you've talked about the importance of moral grounding and the importance of vision and courage, and then analysis. So what we like to do is, you have spoken with such eloquence for so many years for so many, and given voice to so many. And what we want to do is talk about you today. And we want to hear from you, of course, and we're going to hear from you some more, but we want you to hear from us. This symposium is about you and why you have been such a transformational figure and what you have given to us. And so I'd like to move on with this program and get to the gentleman you mentioned, Reverend David Wallace, who might share with us as we go through a sort of a genealogy of your career. Reverend Wallace talked to us about the early Chicago Breadbasket movement, which President Nixon tried to bite off when he talked about Black capitalism. We know where that came from, didn't come from him. But Reverend Wallace?
Good morning. What a privilege it is to be here and to be among those who have participated and been involved in a portion of Jesse's long and extensive life. I see this morning that, well, Jesse mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich. Jesse and I took a class over at the University of Chicago Divinity School at the time, and our professor was Dr. Alvin Pitcher. And his wife, my sister Sarah, and son Pablo are also on this call today. But that was a very important class because Dr. Pitcher was not just a professor in the classroom, he was also an organizer out in the streets. And so that we went to school in the morning and would be out in the streets organizing in the afternoon and evening. And this was the build-up to Operation Breadbasket, to Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Dr. King coming to Chicago. But one of the things that we learned right there in the halls of Chicago Theological Seminary, we were developing relationships. And I see that I think Dave and Toko, who also went to Selma in 1965. I believe they're also on this call, and there may be others. And I salute all of those who participated at that time. But one of the things that happened at Chicago Theological Seminary with Reverend Jackson and Gary Masoni and Dave and Toko and Dr. Pitcher and many others is that we became a band of brothers. Not only at CTS, but also in Operation Breadbasket, solidifying a team of Black and white guys with the love of Jesus and the appreciation of the role of the churches could play in the drive for justice. Because I think, as Jesse was saying, there is no gap between Jesus and justice. And we were learning that both in the classroom as well as in the streets. And I think David Morrow, the author of Why Men Hate Going to Church, said it well. A band of brothers, though he may not realize it, every man longs to be a part of one. It's the model Jesus left for us. If the church was offering this kind of fellowship, united in purpose, mutually supportive, and accomplishing great things, you would not be able to blast men out of the church. And I've since learned that and reflected back on the things that we have had the opportunity of doing. You see, we were a band of brothers. We had a why, we had a direction defining our what and a how to move. And we were about opening forever closed opportunities for Black men and women in all of society. And by the time we included minority businessmen in our negotiations, we had a universal appeal, not only in the Black community, but substantial support in middle-class white suburbs. It was a great time that the Lord blessed us in a mighty way.
Wow. Yeah, yes. That is amazing. So were you in seminary the whole time together?
Yes, Jesse and I both dropped out at the same time and went to work for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
You both dropped. But were you studying? Were you together? I mean, were you matriculating?
Oh, yeah.
Same time. And so what was that like? Did some of these discussions that morphed into your later philosophy that you talked about, did some of these begin in your classes? Do you recall controversies or discussions in your classes?
Absolutely. In our Old Testament class, we were reading Abraham Heschel's The Prophet, for example. And Dr. Heschel happened to be a good friend of Dr. King's and marched with him on many occasions. With our faculty, Dr. Schomer, president of CTS, and CTS gave, as I understand, the first honorary degree to Martin Luther King. So that we had that kind of tradition, that CTS had the tradition of understanding the social gospel right there in the halls of CTS. We carried on such discussions in and out of class. There was a lot of dynamic going on in Chicago at the time, the school boycotts back in the early 60s. While we were tangentially involved, but after Selma, we became much more intentionally involved in figuring out what kind of role we would play in civil rights. We did not know at that time that Dr. King would come to Chicago, but soon after that, we found out. And Jesse and I were students at the Urban Training Center for Christian Mission that was set up in Chicago. We were the first seminarians. They did not want seminarians because they thought we were too green and didn't have the experience. But by the grace of God and the clout of our Chicago Theological Seminary faculty and administration, we were admitted. and we met people like Archie Hargraves and C.T. Vivian came to Chicago and joined that, and Jim Morton and many others. And we learned organizing. Saul Alinsky even came and spoke to our group. We were not learning the Saul Alinsky method, but at least we knew who he was. We were familiar with the Woodlawn organization. It was just a few blocks away from Midway Plaisance there at the university. And we were definitely in the streets. Victor, not only Dr. Obenhaus, but Dr. Schrader in church sociology. What was that, Jess?
Frank Littell.
Yes, Dr. Littell, our church history professor. When the Selma issue came up, Dr. Littell encouraged his students to get caught in the act, even though others at CTS suggested we ought to stay and prepare for our finals. We took off and caravaned down to Selma. We took a quarter of our student body and a third of our faculty and went down there, joining 50,000 other Americans following Bloody Sunday in March of 1965. And that began to solidify in our own minds our commitments, our interests, our desires, our understanding that yes, Jesus and justice were so integrally entwined that we needed to be engaged as he would want us to be engaged.
Yes. Well, let me ask you, what about the early years of Breadbasket? You were with Reverend Jackson the early years of Operation Breadbasket.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us, share with us a little about that? How that?
Well, not only were we engaging in discussion, we began to put it into concrete action when Bloody Sunday did take place in March of 1965, and we went to Selma. And on our way back, Gary Massoni, Jesse, myself, and Jim Burford. Jim, we were riding in Jim's little Volkswagen bus as we returned, and we were talking about how we could become involved. And that summer, we were doing some scouting. Jesse was busy scouting out churches, meeting pastors, saying where should we go? Where should our headquarters be? And he mentioned Reverend Cobbs and Reverend Evans and other pastors. And by the end of the summer, Dr. King was negotiating with coming to Chicago as the first Northern venture. And so Jesse and I went into the Urban Training Center that fall. And later that fall, when Dr. King had solidified that he definitely was coming, Dr. Pitcher recommended Jesse and me to go on Dr. King's SELC staff to have some local involvement. And we went down to Atlanta for our first staff meeting just before Thanksgiving in 1965. Jesse and I were students. We were getting a small stipend. we certainly didn't have credit cards or funds for meals and hotel accommodations, but we had planned, we could arrange our tickets so that we could go to Atlanta, finish our meeting in Atlanta, fly to Greenville, and spend a day or two with his family, and then back to Chicago. Well, that Monday, by 5 o'clock that evening, we were not finished with the SCLC staff meeting agenda. And Dr. King said, "Oh, we need to meet again tomorrow." We were gravely concerned because we didn't have money for food or hotel reservations. And Dr. King says, "That is no problem. Come home with me." So he took Jesse and myself and two other gentlemen, Jesse and me, to home for not only dinner, but to spend the night, and two other gentlemen from New York, Stanley Levinson, one of his fundraisers, and Jack Odell, a union organizer from New York. And the thing that impressed me, he did not call Mrs. King and tell her he was bringing 4 extra mouths for dinner. But we dined sufficiently, had a great evening of discussion. Jesse and I displaced Marty and Dexter from their beds. They slept on pallets that night, and we slept in their beds. Got up the next day, finished the meeting, and we flew off to Greenville to spend time with his mother, Helen, Mama Helen, and his grandmother Tibby.
So can we get
I think what we shouldn't miss here is that we always send people south to help the South. One south to help Emmett Till, going south for the demonstrations. I guess he was coming to Chicago. For the first time, black ministers had the press conference. Said he shouldn't come, attacking him.
Yep.
One minister said on TV, Dr. King should go to hell. It made CBS, NBC, and ABC News that night. And ministers who are on dailyless payroll as commissioners and all that, who had been for Dr. King in the South, visited him in Chicago. So we had to organize ministers who met in Chicago in CTS every Wednesday. Core group ministers to give Dr. King a base. So CTS became a base for Dr. King. We had Reverend Evans and Reverend Thurston, Reverend Freeman, Reverend Sims, Reverend Cobbs, and they would meet with the seminary professors. The professors, they were glad to meet with ministers who were there in practical ministry. The ministers were glad to be with professors at the university. That was an interesting dynamic there. And so we began to core. Reverend Evans, we identified him as the guy who had really all the right gifts. You see, his theology was more about piety than about power. He had all the gifts to attract people. So we began to revolve around his church. I really do think that the CTS gave us a platform. Breadbasket meetings took place in our seminary, in our dining room for about 2 years. So many people were coming until the students at the McGibbon House couldn't eat. So we had to get us another place. But the CTS was at the beginning where ministers were organized. And the Urban Training Center was about how do you train urban preachers. Civil rights, they had public accommodations. They had the right to vote in some measure. They were gerrymandered out of power. They had these rights. How do you have urban training? It's a Reverend C.T. Vivian, who was on Dr. King's staff, and Archer Hargraves and Dean Morton, was training ministers how to deal. These called the plunge. That ministers come to Chicago on Friday, get like $2 and how you survive on the streets to Monday morning, less than $5. It's the way street people had to survive. We call it the plunge. So I think the most critical point about the CTS and that piece was that movement came north. There was no base. There was a base of ministers who were willing to take public positions against Dr. King. He'd never known that in the South before. We organized. We buttressed, built a wall to protect him from that, and that's really became our entry into Dr. King, really.
Yeah, yeah, if we could still like to hear a word from Reverend Wallace. One of the things we wanted to hear you share was your just your early experience with Operation Breadbasket, specifically that. I know that Reverend Jackson was not the originator of it. That came through SCLC, but Reverend Jackson was appointed the Chicago head. You remember those heady moments in the beginning of Operation Breadbasket?
Absolutely, and I'm sorry that Reverend Deppy is not with us today because he captured much in his book on Operation Breadbasket, the untold story of civil rights in Chicago. Reverend Deppy happened to be one of those ministers who was involved, came to the first meeting. Dr. King and Reverend Evans called a meeting, and we were able to meet, and Dr. King laid out what Operation Breadbasket was all about. It was a program of the ministers to pursue jobs. And interestingly enough, the civil rights leaders in Spokane, the secular civil rights leader in Chicago, were skeptical of the ministers because they had seen too many pastors be co-opted by the Democratic machine, and they had various city programs such as Head Start and other such child care programs that they could be intimidated to support the machine rather than to support Dr. King. However, those ministers came together and decided that we wanted to participate in this program, and we set up a meeting at Fellowship every week, and set up organizing committees to begin to identify potential targets and to start the work. And the enthusiasm was very great at that point. I had the privilege of being the secretary of keeping the records on that, and people like Reverend Claude Wyatt and Stroy Freeman and John Thurston and Frank Sims and many others came together. Hiram Crawford and became the backbone of Operation Breadbasket, carrying the work. And as Reverend Jackson prepared us for going into negotiations, and our team learned very quickly that many of these companies did not want to hear from us. They did not want to see us. They had to deal with unions. Why did they have to deal with a bunch of preachers? And they began to see that preachers, yes, had piety, but also had power. And we would exercise that. And so we selected targets, the first targets of where there were perishable products, such as milk. Milk cannot remain on the shelves too long without going sour, and they could not, there's no way they could reuse it. And so our first negotiations were really kind of nasty, kind of.
What do you mean by nasty?
Well, they just really did not want to see us. They thought we were a fly by night.
So how did you force them to see you?
We stopped buying their products.
And the boycott forced them, huh?
Yes, in the store.
Brad, I think that I really want to get in is that he did not come to Chicago for, he came to Chicago for urban education.
Who came? Dr. King?
Yeah, 600,000 students in the schools at that time. CCCO was 50 organizations. One group wanted Dr. King to go to Harlem, where there was some infrastructure in New York. But Chicago had the CCCO and leading these massive school boycotts. But the ministers were not involved in that. And to Dr. King, how can I do something preachers can do? And it was the ministers like the jobs and rights, type of jobs and rights. Bevel was focused on the west side on unity and slums. When a lot of people, the American Friends Service Committee on how getting children to urinate in bottles to take it to prove there was lead paint. C.T. Vivian was teaching ministers at the Urban Training Center. And once we got involved, John Johnson, Al Johnson, the Johnson Products Company, John Johnson, they support Dr. King in the general sense on education. That's not what the interest was. Breadbasket had an appeal to them.
Yeah.
And we would find the jobs. I remember Mr. Bush came to a meeting on 47th Street one day and said,
Who did? Who?
Bush, the construction guy, said
Okay.
in Chicago, said just getting jobs, we want business. So we formed the construction wing. We built the first chain store on 47th in Calumet. First time blacks ever built a chain store. And then the garbage workers came, the guys that owned the trucks. So we want to pick up the garbage. If you pick up the garbage at a given chain store, sludge is sludge. If you've got a contract to get garbage from 10 stores over a period of time, you can buy a whole new stock of trucks. And then Johnson couldn't get Jet and Ebony in the grocery stores. Joseph could get his milk on the shelves, Parkhouse sausage. So all these, the economic magnetism of Breadbasket became a wheel of interest. And there were those who were not interested, frankly, in the education thing per se, should have been, but they were not per se. And so you had the Breadbasket ministers exploding, and you had, at some point in time, we determined that unity in Islam would not work unless you expand. Blacks could not live west of Alston. We started marching for open housing. Bevel and I were quite close to that. I ended up being the spokesman in part for that march. So several things were happening at the same time. I'm trying to say that was the unity in slums on the west side. That was the lead paint and urine for the children that we were fighting against that. And that was the education thing. And Breadbasket took on a life of its own. And many citizens like Cleveland, LA, around the country became interested in Breadbasket than the other program Dr. King had. In his last speech in Memphis, he referred to Breadbasket, to our work, and because we found that we could leverage consumer strength to bring profound changes. Wall Street and Silicon Valley are extensions of that idea, leveraging our reputations and our consumer strength in the marketplace.
No, that's fascinating, because actually that was one that was a question for me. Strategically how you went about it, and who were your first targets, and so from there, did the Wall Street Project morph out of Operation Breadbasket or out of push?
It did morph out of Breadbasket. The idea was that we focused on public sector, but the private sector is where the wealth is. We're private sector strength we've never really had not explored. And so when we began to deal with milk companies, we know the cows could not hold that milk in the udder very long. So you get truck driver. Blacks could not drive trucks, milk trucks. So we got truck driving jobs. And then with the National Tea Store, Black business people had to sit in the colored section where they couldn't get their products dealt with. So the result of that was we began to expand this market. And a movement of its own developed. A movement of its own developed. And so we had consumer clubs. We found the bad meat, the south and west side was rotten compared to suburban meat. Prices were cheaper in the suburbs than in the cities. We get to unravel the whole urban abandonment scene. We got deep and deeper into that.
So can you say a little about these clubs you just mentioned?
Consumer clubs. We would check out an ad in the Chicago Defender, Julius Milk, Parkhouse sausage, other products with the black companies. People would go shopping and they would look at, put on their refrigerator, black products.
Mm-hmm.
But the store, if they didn't have that product, they would demand it. They didn't get it. So we began to penetrate the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty soon we found ourselves able to negotiate. I learned negotiating really, if you live in the South, you negotiate with white people to survive. You have to figure out how to negotiate to survive. I worked with Core at A&T. We began to don't buy where you can't eat. Don't shop where you can't use the facility, that type. I thought that particular skill from A&T and Core, was Jim Farmer and Alan Powell had done that the years before. We learned how to negotiate, and so we took on the audacity to negotiate. And then we convinced the companies that not just, it was very added, not just the cost of doing business, that you had more products, you had more business.
Okay. No, that's very, very interesting. Very interesting. As I reflected on the roots of Operation Breadbasket in particular, under your leadership, because it was sort of different before you got it, right? Operation Breadbasket. It had a different focus under SCLC.
It was just on jobs. In Chicago, we had this body of manufacturing. Johnson Products couldn't get the products on the shelves.
Right.
You couldn't have it on the shelves. You couldn't get Julius milk on the shelves. And so we began, in the South, the focus on public accommodation, the right to vote, right? Earlier, you had the right to vote. Economics became the theme of the hour. And cities around the country, Cleveland, Cincinnati, they wanted breadbasket. And Dr. King had his anxiety about breadbasket. He liked it, but he didn't like it. Dr. King felt that a few Black millionaires would deal with the issue of job, justice, health, and education. He had this tension between the social vision of healthcare for all, and education for all, jobs for all, not just. So I go to Memphis sometimes, and you get say 20 Black basketball with all the millionaires. It does nothing with the broad base of concern. So he had this tension in his soul between Breadbasket. But when he came to Chicago one time, I think it may have been a turning point for him, that he was coming to borrow $35,000 for payroll. And he couldn't get in Atlanta. The Black banks couldn't lend it without facing examination. Whites wouldn't lend it to him. So he came to Chicago to make payroll. As Dr. King was stopped by Dr. Abdul-Tay's house, some Black business guys want to meet with you. I'm very busy. I can't stop. And so Chauncey Estridge, who was his lawyer, said, the business guys want to help you, Dr. King. So they stopped by, and they gave him $55,000. He cried. He'd never seen Black business people put up money before for civil rights movement. Moving in the South, we got money from churches and membership cards, and there was no business class supporting the rest of the South. This is the first time that breakthrough. And so as we helped business, they helped us. So our financial base support was Black businesses.
Your Operation Breadbasket, biggest base of support was Black businesses?
Yeah. Because the guys had the garbage trucks, Smith and those guys, they would contribute, and the products and the goods and services. We had Blacks for the first time doing security at the stores. At that time, there was no Black checkout counters. We had the American business cards. These people had the Blacks, the checkout. No Blacks didn't check out in the yellow stores. No Blacks had the meat counters. The infrastructure of the urban stores was all white. And when we got through training people how to do that, it changed fundamentally. We worked from jobs to work on economic spoke. The manufacturing spoke, construction spoke. All these spoke together in economic power.
Well, let me ask you, can you talk a little about Joe Louis Milk, the wax company? Do you have some involvement with and involvement with some of the black banks and that kind of, just could just.
They couldn't get Julius milk on the shelves. They had pet milk and all that.
Mm-hmm.
We demand to have our shelves facing. If you have 20 cases of milk and 2 Julius, it looks unworthy. Share facing, it looks like pet incarnation. You go in the store where they have the racks for the books, papers. If Jet and Evidence in the rack, people would buy them. So that became, and also Jet and Evidence began to promote us. And that became our national platform.
I remember that. Every week.
We got black ads in black newspapers. They began to promote us. So we began to, that became dimensions of it that we didn't have. Dr. King brought the movement to Chicago. The kind of minister you find a job, the big stuff is education. We made it remember the big stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to ask you something, Reverend, if you would. We're seeing this moment today. We're seeing an extraordinary new milestone in our struggle with young people today, with Black Lives Matter protests, and I'm speaking of Black Lives Matter. I'm not talking about all the fringe stuff that goes on around them. But in terms of what difference what would you say to, and what difference do you see in the approach of activists today to economic progress and economic democracy? What difference do you see, and what possibilities do you see? All that in the context of like how you began with Operation Breadbasket.
Dr. King came out of the Black Church and the National Baptist Convention, and he built upon the legacy of struggle. He didn't start something new. Even SNCC was connected to that movement. Dr. King put the first $5,000 for SNCC, for example. But when Mandela and his partner, the youth division of ANC, they hooked up with ANC. There's a group now that they detach themselves from our tradition of leadership and organize. What happened there is not new. It's built upon. You can't run past the right to vote. I said to a student up in Minnesota where George Floyd had been killed, we were putting flowers at his site where he was killed. So we was not registered to vote. I'm not going to vote there. I'm voting because I'm into this. I'm not into the system. I said, well, if the guy who killed George Floyd come to court, would you find him guilty? I'd bust him. I'd bust him. I said, well, on the registered voters and stuff, on the juries, I said, oh, he didn't know any better.
He didn't know that you had to be able to vote to get on the jury?
Yeah, registered voters on juries.
Mm.
So Dr. King focused on some, the public accommodation was a very fundamental movement. The right to vote was very fundamental. And today, the progress we have and those that comes out of nonviolent action. The public accommodation comes out of mass discipline, direct action. Right to vote comes out of discipline, direct action. And the housing come out of it. In the war came out of direct action, nonviolent action. And that's what's happening today. And so I saw an iconic picture from students at Howard, 1932, marching on the campus, say, stop lynching. They're saying Black Lives Matter. We've been saying Black Lives Matter for a long time. And hashtag Black Lives Matter comes out of Ferguson, where Dale had been killed and Tripon had been killed and Michael Brown had been killed, and people walk away without any accountability and said, don't Black Lives Matter. And that morphed into a whole expression, Black Lives Matter. But Black Lives Matter for a long time. And so what we were struggling to do is try to interpret it in a way where we connect with each other. Because I want students to 4 million high school students register a year. We said, if every high school senior comes across the saves the diploma in one hand and voter card in the other, they have power. We wouldn't Dr. King marched in '63. Selma to, well, from Texas to Florida to Maryland, we couldn't use a single public toilet. We couldn't buy ice cream at Howard Johnson. Black soldiers sit behind Nazi pilgrims on American military bases. We without power. Once we got the right to vote, we could begin to change things. Today, it's no accident that the black men in Selma, Alabama, and Montgomery, and Richmond, the Confederate capitals, and Savannah, and Augusta, and Atlanta. Dr. King never saw a black man in Atlanta, by the way, or Washington. This whole explosion of black political figures comes from the right to vote.
So,
and not just blacks, you know, 65 blacks couldn't vote for 85 years. Women could serve on juries. 18-year-olds couldn't vote by language, couldn't vote on campuses. Now, that's a majority. Black votes, 18-year-olds, campus voting, bilingual voting, white women serve on juries, that's a new majority. People were at the new majority would come in 2050 or something like that. It came in 2008 because we empowered most Americans were disenfranchised. Only white men was supreme, really.
So
the white men were the Allied palace. They had all the power.
Well, Reverend, if I might just interrupt. So we had Operation Breadbasket, and that opened a lot of doors. That dealt with black economics. Today we have a very, very different situation as a result of the work of Operation Breadbasket and similar efforts. The movement today is very much concerned about police brutality against political empowerment. But we don't seem to hear as much about economic empowerment and how and the kind of strategies to follow. Do you have any thoughts on that, on this new generation's approach to economic?
What Maynard Jackson did was say you can't get contracts unless you include blacks. That makes the leveraging of EEOC and contract compliance in these cities, that's different. So what we kind of renegade protesters, negotiators, now these mayors have the leverage to determine who will get pensions on investment, you know, who will get contracts for jobs and contracts. We didn't have that. We had none of that at that time.
So you suggesting being in dialogue with and having and doing strategic, I don't want to say pressuring, strategic informing of these political leaders in these positions. Well, let's say pressuring them to do some of the things you're talking about. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, we went to Wall Street and they didn't became holiday. We challenged them, became very public and exposing Wall Street, embarrassing Wall Street really. And they agreed to make King Holiday on Wall Street comes out of our Breadbasket, our movement on Wall Street. We met at the Wonders of the World, had Clinton as our co-chair, and we met. And we were able to get the companies, first of that, black underwriters. So it's Jim Reynolds and John Rogers that comes out of the whole body of blacks that have done the underwriting. They come the same schools white went to, Columbia, Harvard, and all that. They couldn't get in. Effort and excellence means a lot. Inheritance and access means more. Unless you break that cycle, you never get what they call a club. We used embarrassment to break that cycle. We went to Silicon Valley, had 185 board members, white males, 36 white women, 3 blacks, and 1 Latino. We began to expose the companies that didn't have a black on the board. It became embarrassing to the image of themselves. We didn't have a talent deficit, had an opportunity deficit. So now the chairman board of Microsoft, John Thompson, is African American, who went to Florida A&M, I remember that. You have on Jim Bell Bowens on the board of Apple. All of them that have black board members, it came because of our pressure.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I'd like to ask, we're going to be closing this segment, but I'd like to ask Rem Wallace, just from his bird's eye perch, where did the efforts of Operation Push get the strongest resistance, Reverend Wallace?
Certainly from the political structures in Chicago at that time. But Breadbasket and Push went in with a desire to heal brokenness, because we saw brokenness all around us throughout the community. So that our commitment was yes, to justice, but to try to bring some healing into the situation. And that's where Reverend Jackson really shone in our situation, that even though we had opposition, and even though people would stand up to us, we did not back down. The ministers did not back down. Jesse Jackson did not back down, and would bring the issues and try to define the issues so clearly that they could not ignore them. For example, there was a time when the Chicago Metropolitan Press completely ignored what was taking place in the Black community, particularly the things that SCLC was involved in, be it on the West Side or Operation Breadbasket. And one of the ways we figured out how to get around them is that we put together the community press ran our press releases and our photos. And we would take those clippings and we would send them to the New York Times and to the Washington Post and CBS and others. And those national organizations would call into the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times and say, well, what's going on in Chicago? And the local press did not know, because they were not covering us. And they were embarrassed into the point of where they were having to respond to our calls and talk with Reverend Jackson and attend our press conferences. So that, yes, there was opposition, but our job was to try to figure out strategies around those periods of opposition.
How old were you all then? You all were like in your early 20s? Was that, you were about in your early 20s at that time? Is that the case?
Around 24.
Yeah,
24.
That's amazing. We see the same thing happening today, but that's so amazing that you all took on those corporations at that youthful age. And as I said, we're seeing the same kind of thing now, the same kind of energy that's really built on the shoulders of what came before. Reverend Jackson, did you have a closing comment?
I saw a list
in this segment.
Saw a list in Woodlawn had a movement to stop the university from gentrifying the community out. How you build resistance to universities, the gentrification really. They were on the south side of the university. We were on Kenwood, Oakland. It was gang territory. I developed a rapport with the gangs. And you had Kenwood, one community, and Oakland, another community. We found that Cocoa. Kenwood community, which still exists today. They didn't want black kids to go across 47th Street south to Hyde Park and Kenwood School. So I built the school that came high. Miss Hannah Smith, she led that drive. We were learning how to organize. And first, they didn't want to name the school King High. They thought every would be a riot. So getting the name King High was a big deal. Building a new school was kind of like in the South. They built new schools to keep blacks from desegregated. But the big King High was the most modern school in the city. We built relationships. I think that the key to that thing really became Reverend Evans. I don't know what ingenuity fits in it, but I went to we were Dr. King.
Reverend Clay Evans?
Yeah, Dr. King came to speak at St. John Church. Reverend Evans was the president of the Ministers Conference. And you see, he had that special stuff, that special gifts he had. And so I detected he had the ability to do something. So one Sunday while going to church, and he's saying, I'm going to see how Jesus, a very powerful rendition. Went to his church. And I went and met with him. And he said, Jason, what is that them marching? It's all about us. He said, I read about, I don't read this, but I read the Bible. So I knew kind of where his head was. Passionate man, very concerned, but it was piety, not power. So we went down to a woman named Eva Corley Street. She sat on a chair with a stick fighting off rats, biting her feet. Her husband had Down syndrome, her son, grandson had Down syndrome. So I said, Reverend Evans, I want you to meet a woman, knowing his heart. He saw her and he had compassion. She joined fellowship in her house. And I had Jeremy Masoni and David, they took pictures of this drummer. Bob Johnson Jet was Dr. King, so next weekend, Claire was all over Jet magazine. Charlie Munson stand with Dr. King fighting in slums. He got projected on that. And when he got projected and supported Dr. King, then the powers moved on him. And we took Breadbasket and Ministers Conference together to support. And the minister said, don't bring that King stuff in here. Reverend Evans said, you can vote it down, but we'll have on the floor. Minister went and got the gun. Minister had to leave that church and go back to fellowship. He determined not to let Dr. King's program succeed in Chicago. And when Dr. King, so I went to meet with Dr. King. I think we have claims on our side, what you call it 2 o'clock on Thursday. So I went to meet Reverend Evans in his office, and telephone rang. Ms. Lucy Loma, who was his secretary, Reverend Evans, don't talk to me, I'm at a conference, don't talk to me. Dr. King's on the phone. He picked it. Hello, Dr. King. That was a setup call, you know. Dr. King called Clay. He invited Reverend Evans, Dr. King, to speak to his church. They cut the money off his church for 7 years. That church stood as an embarrassment for 7 years. Did not get the money to build fellowship. It's built on integrity of his not bowing. So organizing from ministers to business people, and pretty soon it morphed into a political movement because it became the most specific thing happening in the SLC Arsenal at that time.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. There's so much there. But we have to move on. But I'm really appreciating this. This has been a real slice of history. All around Operation Breadbasket, before and after, and there's much to be learned from it. And thank you so much, Reverend Wallace, for your input and for your sharing. And Reverend Jackson, we will hear from you a bit more later. But right now, I'd like to pivot. We've heard a lot about many of the figures in the movement and in the Chicago movement in particular. But what we haven't heard really about is some of the additional important partners that are often unsung. I've heard Reverend Jackson speak of them, but they're largely unsung. And that is the women who are involved in the Chicago Civil Rights Movement, the Black women who have played such an integral part. And I like to shift to my dear colleague, Dr. Joanne Terrell, professor there at Chicago Theological Seminary, a brilliant theologian, a student of James Cone. We had the pleasure of a meeting, of speaking at a session with Operation Push several years together. Reverend Jackson invited us to be on a panel together. And so she's going to talk to us about the role of Black women in the Chicago Civil Rights Movement, an area that's unsung, but so very, very important. Welcome to you, Dr. Terrell.
Thank you, Dr. Hendricks, and hello, everyone. Thank you, Reverend Brian Smith, for the invitation to serve on this panel to celebrate Juneteenth and the legacy of the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr. and us women in the Chicago Civil Rights Movement. I am the Reverend Dr. Joanne Marie Terrell, Associate Professor of Theology, Ethics, and the Arts at Chicago Theological Seminary. Many of you do not know this story, but back in 2000, the then president of CTS, the Reverend Dr. Susan Thistlethwaite, gave the task of examining Reverend Jackson for the completion of his Master of Divinity degree, which he began at CTS in 1964 before Dr. King pressed him into active duty for the SCLC. He likes to pretend that I taught him everything that he knows, but we all know that that is not true. I would like to begin this part of the discussion by describing myself as a Black womanist, Christian, spiritually eclectic theologian. My mentors are the late Reverend Dr. James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, and Dr. Dolores Seneva Williams, a premier womanist theologian and Presbyterian lay woman who, with the Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Grant, the late Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, and others, comprised the first wave of womanist scholars who pushed back on Black theology for its masculinist version of what redemption in the African American community looks like. Black theology and Black church theology, and there are distinctions between them, can almost be forgiven for overlooking Black women's particular needs and contributions to the struggle for physical and spiritual freedom. After all, in the sacred of America's documents, Constitution, the framers had declared Black and Native men 3/5 human for the purposes of boosting congressional representation for the white Southern slave-holding class. And their descendants targeted and censured Black men in a singular way by severely minimizing their ability to participate in the post-slavery workforce, such that even today, there are few corridors to Black male empowerment beyond the military and the church. And Black men and boys provided and provide frontline fodder for the school to prison pipeline and for the literal and figurative cannons of a nation engaged in and addicted to perpetual warfare. It is for these reasons and more that the most iconic and poignant protest sign of the civil rights movement read, "I am a man." This is why those early womanist theologians and ethicists made clear that they empathize with Black men's social positionality, even as they critiqued the perquisites of the masculine perspective. Just as vigorously, they criticized white feminist theology for its conscious and unconscious racism via their exclusion of Black women's experience in their presumptions about what constitutes women's experience. Thus, when Alice Walker coined the term womanist, deriving it from the Black folks saying, "You acting womanish," to describe the willful, courageous, audacious, serious, and in charge behavior of Black women and girls who were and are committed to the survival and wholeness of an entire people, male and female. She evoked the women of the Chicago Civil Rights Movement who allied with Black men of our city, such as the Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr. and the late Mayor Harold Washington. I refer to these women and others beyond Chicago as proto-womanists. The first proto-womanists who come to mind were contemporaries, friends and colleagues, the Reverend Dr. Addie L. Wyatt, whose years are from 1924 to 2012, and the Reverend Dr. Willie Taplin Barrow, whose years are from 1924 to 2015, who established themselves as voices who could not be silenced, as forces of nature with which to be reckoned. These were women whose voices, though they have passed away, still speak. As a precocious girl child, Addie Cameron moved from Mississippi to Chicago during the Great Depression. She married Claude Wyatt at the tender age of 16 and reared not only her 2 sons, but also several siblings because her widowed and sickly father was unable to tend to them. At 17, she landed a job as a typist at Armour and Company and quickly noticed patterns of discrimination against African-American women, for whom she advocated in later years as the founder of the Coalition of Labor Union Women. She was a founding member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists and represented workers' interests across multiple lines of difference for the United Packing House Workers of America, which became the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, becoming the first Black woman to hold senior office in an American labor union as vice president of her local branch. But ultimately, she became the first Black woman international Black vice president of that same union, embodying and empowering the creation of a Black middle class in Chicago, in the nation, and beyond. As an ordained minister in the Church of God and as co-founder of the Vernon Park Church of God in Chicago, the Reverend Addie Wyatt fundamentally understood something. That is, that workers' rights are inviolably related to human rights, that human rights are civil rights, and that civil rights are the very human rights, the very basic presumption that Black people everywhere we live are worthy of respect and dignity as human beings made in the imago Dei, a presumption granted to others that Black people in this country are still seeking. She also understood the concept of intersectionality before jurist Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, and the power of alliance, a legacy of her influence on the development of Operation Breadbasket, which came to life at Chicago Theological Seminary through the activist arm of then CTS student, the Reverend Jesse L. Jackson Sr. A highlight of my tenure at CTS was presenting Dr. Wyatt with a Doctor of Divinity degree honoris causa. Another proto-womanist, the Reverend Willie Taplin Barrow, similarly understood the power of alliance and intersectionality through what Congressman Jackson referred to as complete determination to defend the human rights of all people. The little warrior, the princess and high priest of protest, as she was often called, was as influential in shaping the progressive tendentiousness of the civil rights movement in Chicago and on the Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. as almost any other person. As a co-founder of Operation Breadbasket, now Operation Push, People United to Serve Humanity, and as its first woman chief executive officer, she was a staunch war resistor and a fierce voice for LGBTQ persons, another instance of the definition of womanist and the commitments of womanists and Black feminists and our allies. I do not know if Chicago Theological Seminary has offered an honorary degree posthumously, but if ever there was a candidate, the Reverend Dr. Willie Taplin Barrow would be one. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement was organic, just as the Black Lives Matter movement is today. As a leader in the movement, Reverend Jackson followed the instincts of the women who encouraged him and others out of their womanish sensibilities for our profoundly maligned and profoundly hybrid, non-monolithic community to listen to the voices of other profoundly marginalized people in American society, whether they are treated in this way because of the nuanced issue of race. And it is a shame that degrees of Blackness or brownness is a metric by which human worth is measured, or whether because of their sexual orientation. It is a shame people
Dr. Terrell? Dr. Terrell, we're not seeing you.
If she's frozen, I think her feed is frozen for a second.
Looks like her feed is
Yeah.
frozen. Well,
We do have the Dr.
I'd like to bring Dr. Jeanette Wilson is also here to talk about this subject. Pardon me, were you going to say something, Brian?
I was just sharing that Dr. Jeanette Wilson was here. Fine.
Yeah, and she's been with Operation Push for many years. She's seen all kinds of things. I'd like to get your perspective, if you would, on the involvement of women from your perspective, from what you have seen, and being a woman yourself, your own involvement and maybe challenges as well. Dr. Jeanette Wilson.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, and I thank Dr. Ray and Reverend Brian Smith for sharing this moment with my mentor, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and the mentor of all mentors, Dr. Otis Moss Jr. I have a unique perspective, I think, because I am both, I have both a background of law and faith. And so I've had mentors, women mentors who are extremely powerful in both sectors. One, when I think about Lucille Conway Lohman, she never got the recognition that she deserved, but she built movements through the faith community, placed pastors in key positions and organized religious affairs in ways that I've not seen done since since she died and made her transition. She had a spiritual presence and forcefulness about the Word of God and the power of God that represented just ordinary women doing extraordinary things, coming out of rather humble circumstances, but moving to a different level by her service, and yet remained a very strong connection in the church at Fellowship. And so you have Lucille Lohman, you have Reverend Willie Barrow. Her greatest strength, I think, was she's a preeminent organizer and could just shut down stores and cause you to march, just would empower you when she shut down different stores and the Dan Ryan Expressway when they would not allow Black contractors to do business. It was her force of will, a short woman in stature, but had that belief that she could do anything and could organize anybody to do anything if she could just breathe breath in them. And then you had the Reverend Addie Wyatt, very stately labor leader. And so she always connected the movement to the labor organizations and was able to organize women in labor in a very different kind of way. she was the most dressed up female in labor I had ever seen, because most of the women had a conflict as to how they were to look if they were going to be labor leaders. Well, Reverend Addie Wyatt did not compromise her presentation, but was able to articulate the issues, whether it was workers in the farms raising chickens or in other situations. And so she led the labor movement with a strong faith in God, and used her church as a way of organizing people around labor and faith. And so it was just very interesting to be able to work with them and to learn from them. And then I had the opportunity to work with Jewel LaFontaine Mancarius, John Rogers' mother, and to watch her on the inside of corporations where she served on boards and where she also practiced law, to be able to leverage our push for inclusion with her ability to negotiate on the other side and make sure that she would interpret the messages from our economic withdrawal of enthusiasm in a manner that allowed companies to give us what we deserved in the first place. And I learned from her with the Revlon boycott. She was able to aid in translating the messages that we were sending. And then you had Dr. Alexis Herman, who had been Undersecretary of Labor, who had been Chief of Staff, a phenomenal woman leader out of the South, who used her heritage to transform some corporate opportunities, and as well as the political shaping that she was able to do in several campaigns, from Carter all the way to Clinton. And then locally, look at women that are not as visible. Georgia English Palmer here in Chicago worked with her husband, Lou Palmer, organizing forums and platforms that would result in changes in aldermanic elections, as well as the election of late Mayor Harold Washington. I think about Reverend's wife, Mrs. Jacqueline Jackson. Many people see her as she is Mrs. Jacqueline Jackson, but she led women on international human rights crusades. She was the one that really engaged women in a very positive way in Breadbasket, Rainbow Push, and is the creative force behind many of the things we do when you think about bringing prison art to Breadbasket, and prison artists sharing different programs and initiatives that were more culturally relevant. That was Mrs. Jacqueline Jackson. And then I look at women like Alice Tregay, who was a political strategist who trained people in civics education by causing you to work in the vineyards, if you will, organized campaigns across the state of Illinois, taught us what political lobbying really meant without the resources that most lobbyists have. Just a powerful woman teaching voter registration and voter engagement. Then you have also here, who's been here longer than I have, started in the very beginning, Betty Magnus. That's this consistent thread of women who sacrificed family, time, and resources to invest in the movement without much recognition and very little credit for the work that they've done. And they stand in the tradition of Septima Clark and some others that are written vaguely in some of the history books, but you see these women that have been pulling the movement and pushing their children. Some they by birth, and others they just adopted and drug us kicking and screaming forward. And then, you look at some of the great women theologians, like, and Dr. Moss knows her better than I did, Dr. Prathia Hall Wynn, one of the greatest women activist preachers coming out of the freedom movement. And so her preaching was not just some symbolic statements that she heard somebody else give. They were out of the bowels of the movement that she had experienced. And I think that's what women bring in many ways, our ability to feel from a mother's perspective, something that is different from men, and our commitment to support even when we don't get the platform and even when we are not recognized. We find the cause bigger than some other things. And I think that what Reverend Jackson has been able to do is to combine the faith, the legal, and the business in this one movement for change, where everyone felt they had a purpose and a role to play, and he could keep you moving.
Yeah, no, we thank you very much, Reverend Wilson. You got a point that's a man keep you going. And you made a point in the Hebrew Bible, the term that's used for mercy, brachem, literally means with a womb.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sort of goes along with what you're saying, the kind of dimension that the sensibilities that women bring to the movements at times that we men don't have. Reverend Dr. Terrell is back, and we'd like you to give a few closing remarks here, Reverend Terrell. We're glad to have you back. Dr. Terrell?
I don't know where I got cut off, but I apologize for the delay. I'm going to start back at.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time in this segment.
It won't be a lot of time. It won't be a lot of time. So I was just saying that it's a shame that degrees of blackness or brownness is a metric by which human worth is measured, or because of one's sexual orientation. It's a shame that people who claim to be Christian or regard them religious also regard LGBTQ persons as unworthy of love, or whether their social, political, and economic views do not line up with American individualistic and capitalistic values. But I also want to say that Reverend Jackson is also undoubtedly sustained by the tenacious work of the Reverend Jeanette Wilson Esquire, his longtime advisor and national director of Push Excel. And I would really, if I did not mention the influence of one who I would identify as proto-womanist, if not a womanist, and that is Reverend Jackson's spouse, Mrs. Jacqueline Jackson, raising their children to become attentive to the civil rights movement, not merely because of legacy, but primarily because she herself was and is invested in the survival and wholeness of entitles, male and female. After meeting and marrying Reverend Jackson and learning from the likes of Wyatt and Barrow, she continued to educate herself about the plight of oppressed people throughout the world and to cause other people to pay attention. So her audacious advocacy for international human rights dates back to her time at North Carolina A&T, when she studied the conflict between India and Pakistan. She caused a national backlash as she defied the no-talk policy with Palestinians by meeting with Yasser Arafat in 1979, and went to jail for standing against the Navy's use of Vieques, Puerto Rico as a practice ground for their war tactics. When she went, she caused her son to say, "Pray for the Navy." I want to quote another proto-womanist who was not a Chicagoan, but another Mississippian who made an impact on the world when she went to the 1968 Democratic Convention held that year in Chicago. Fannie Lou Hamer famously articulated the pain that African Americans and all people of goodwill feel when we are overwhelmed by the busyness of evil, the bottomless pit out of which comes the hatred aimed against us, the then and current context of voter interposition and nullification. the endless ontological assaults on our identity as children of God by way of every institution of socialization and by way of every Karen and Bob who cannot imagine us as moral, law-abiding, church-going citizens. And year after year, the trickle-down Holocaust of Black and brown bodies. Before winning full representation at the 1968 Democratic Convention for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
Oh boy, Reverend, looks like you're frozen again.
Over.
And she was just as you were getting warmed up. Then no, Reverend, we're gonna talk about you. Let us talk about you. And
these women, we saw them as our mothers. Addie White led a group to Dr. King in '55. Remember, me cousin gave $10,000 SLC, biggest gift they ever had at that time. She received in labor negotiation. Willie Barron was kind of, but women who built churches could build a movement. So we went out of our way to find women who had church building strength. So Willie Brown comes out of the straight church tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But theology expanded by relating to us because the environment helps produce a certain something out of one. But Lucille Loman, we're in our headquarters, she negotiated this building.
Mm.
I first met Jackie, we were in college. And I was a sophomore, she was a freshman. So I had my thing going, you know. And so I wanted to walk to the library. So I said, can I help you with some of your work? Trying to make my entry, you know. I said, I'm trying to figure out how to work on Indian-China border dispute. But I said, what? I was beyond my soul. She always had a sense of the internationalism in her stuff. So I'm saying that Willie Barra and Addie, they adopted us. And we reached out to, a minister made comments to business to deal with this kind of stuff. We get women in the church to be the liaison for the pastor. They became the infrastructure of our struggle. The consumer clubs, the picket lines, ultimately negotiated led by women because we meant to protect women. That was part of Dr. King's philosophy. So Dr. Cotton and 7 o'clock get projected because Dr. King believed that.
Mm-hmm.
What we learned from Dr. King, how to project women who were leaders, who deserve recognition, but who could produce. So I want to thank you, Jeanette, for your work. But the tradition of women in our movement is just stellar.
Yeah, and Dr. Jeanette Wilson, she doesn't play. I tell you, she's a tough one and she gets it done. I'd like to thank Dr. Wilson and Dr. Terrell for these very enlightening remarks about the role of women. I'm sorry that we lost Dr. Terrell because she was just catching fire and maybe it was too much fire for Zoom to handle. But both of you with your presentations were just so illuminating to us. And there's more work that needs to be done on. There are some books I've taught some of those in my classes here at Columbia University, but there's still more work to be done on the role of women in the movement, and particularly in the Chicago movement. So we thank you so very much. And one of the points I've raised is that we have to do much. This is a wonderful session, but we have to do much more work. Pardon me, Reverend.
Yes.
You're mute. Thank you. And we have to do much more work in the future. We have to have more of these sessions. We have to have more study, and that's one of the things that I think is really an indication of this symposium. And I would like to say,
got to go on.
But you have to, brother. You have to.
All right. So hang up because we can hear.
Brian, please mute. Please mute, Brian. So before we move on, I just want to say a few words about Reverend Jackson and the beloved community. It's something that I've written about, and maybe in another forum I'll talk about it in more depth. But Dr. King appropriated the term beloved community from a German philosopher whose name escapes me at the moment. But he had a notion of the beloved community, of which many people have understood in sentimental terms. They've understood it in strictly interpersonal relational terms. But Dr. King had a larger vision, and that vision was based largely on an economic vision. And elsewhere, I've written that the foundation is a democratic socialist vision. And now I mention that because when I told Reverend Jackson that I was writing a book about Dr. King's radicality of his vision, and Reverend said to me, you know, gosh, I've worked with him all those years and I didn't realize how radical his vision is. And I reflected on that, and I thought that was really ironic, because it shows that how someone who is in motion and working every day in the struggle sometimes doesn't get a chance to reflect on the evolution of their own thought, such that Reverend Jesse Jackson didn't seem to realize at that moment how radical his own economic vision had come to be. And it's something I'd love. It'll take a whole day to discuss it, but his vision for economic democracy is an extraordinary one. It's participatory democracy. He's talking about everybody, in the biblical sense, everybody having the right to be all right. Everyone having a chance to eat of the opportunity, the access to eat of the fruit of the tree of the fruit of life. And his economic philosophy is so forward-looking that when you look at what he was talking about in terms of economic democracy in 1988 in his presidential run, and then you look at what Bernie Sanders was talking about as recently as this year, you see that Bernie Sanders' campaign platform is almost identical to Jesse Jackson's campaign platform in 1988, except for the discussions of South Africa and apartheid. And so when we talk about the beloved community, Jesse Jackson has offered a very holistic view of the beloved community. It involves, of course, his political activities, opening of politics. There would not be President Barack Obama if Jesse Jackson had not forced the Democratic Party to open up the way that voter representation, the way that votes are counted. Something as small as the term African American that we use. He popularized that to a great extent. But his vision, his economic vision, his vision of inclusion for all people is one that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is getting much attention for now. Bernie Sanders, but Jesse Jackson presupposed all of them. That as a basis for the kind of community in which we can all live and all have a part and all feel a part. And so at some point, I'd like for us to really, and I'm going to do more work on that, look at Jesse Jackson, his vision. He didn't articulate it as a vision for beloved community, but it definitely builds on Dr. King's vision of a beloved community. And speaking of Dr. King and bridging, I'd like to move at this point to start talking about learning and bridging and building upon the civil rights legacy of Dr. King and Dr. Jesse Jackson's role in it. And we are really honored to have as our discussant a man whose participation in the movement goes back to his early days, who was a colleague of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and who has continued to impart his loving wisdom and his profound insights and his inspirational presence to our movement even up to this day. And I'd like to present to you all Reverend Otis Moss Jr., who is a jewel, a gem in our struggle, in our community, and in the history of African American politics and religion. Reverend Otis Moss Jr.
Thank you, and to all of my friends of many, many years, some, and those who are young since you were born. Thank you for all that you do and for the foundation you have laid. I especially want to thank those of you in academia touching minds and curricula that will last far into generations not yet born. I wish I had enough time to call all of the names here. I want to just focus on a few things with great gratitude. Dr. King globalized the movement in a very special way. I'm not saying that he was the first, but I am saying that I think our video went out, did it? We're back. I was saying Dr. King globalized the movement in a special way. He was not the first. Du Bois did it in a very, very historic way. But the time that Dr. King went to jail with us in the student movement, he was holding at his desk an invitation from the newly elected president of Nigeria that had recently gained its independence. And he put that invitation on hold to go to jail with students in the Atlanta University Center, and ended up being punished in an extraordinary way, in a brutal way, but that punishment impacted the presidential election of 1960.
Yes.
Now, journalists and historians, some of them, have not quite caught up with this.
Right.
But without the dynamic of Dr. King and the intervention of the Kennedy campaign, Kennedy would not have been elected president in 1960.
Yes, sir.
Now, you remember that before Dr. King's arrest with the students, one record shows that Nixon was ahead in the polls.
Mm-hmm.
After Dr. King's arrest and being sentenced 4 months, hard labor on to a Georgia chain gang, it was really a death sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And we were very much aware of that. But the intervention of Senator John Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy turned that around. And in turning that around, it lifted the Kennedy campaign. And he won by, someone has said, less than 1/2 vote per precinct. That kind of history perhaps is not being taught. Dr. King brought this global dimension. It was an intergenerational movement. Remember that Dr. King was not yet 40 years old when he was assassinated. It was intergenerational, with young people on the front lines and elders involved in a creative way, giving their best. The Black church provided, not in every instance, but in significant ways, a prophetic presence. The HBCUs provided a prophetic, generational dimension without which we could not have had a student movement. I cannot overemphasize that. If you look at the prophetic wing of the Black church, the presence of the historically Black colleges and universities, you do not have a human rights, civil rights movement in the Black community. Let me say something about the Black church and borrow from Du Bois. The Black church, in addition to a prophetic presence, also brought a melody and a harmony in an ill harmonizing and unmelodious land. That's a sermon within itself. Persons like Dr. Prathia Hall Wynne, who entered the movement amid all of the dangers, toils, and snares, and came forth as one of the most dynamic, both academicians and activists. And her image, along with others, shall remain with us. One person whose life and work in the movement and contributions are yet to be fully recognized, and I'm speaking of Coretta Scott King. I want to lay that on the line in a special way. Let me come quickly to the summer of 1967 on the campus of the University of Chicago, when Dr. King called a national conference of Black religious leaders. One of the most history-making, history-changing events in that conference was when Dr. King announced that Reverend Jesse Jackson would be the national leader for Operation Breadbasket. That was a history-bearing, history-making, and I boldly state, history-changing moment in the movement. At that very hour, Reverend Jackson was working in the campaigns of two candidates, Carl Stokes of Cleveland and Richard Hatcher of Gary, Indiana, both of whom won. And this was a new chapter above the Mason-Dixon line, if you will, a new chapter in American politics and in African-American politics. In that process, we saw the moral, the spiritual, the economic, the educational, and the political. Reverend Jackson has kept that dynamic alive. We ought to have courses in the curriculum of political science and sociology and other areas with the campaigns of 1984 and 1988. This generation and generations to come can learn much. It ought to be required from those two campaigns. Today, we are drawing from 84 and 85, and many do not know the well from which they draw, but nevertheless, they are drinking water from those wells every day. And the moral, the spiritual, the economic, the educational, and the political. Reverend Jackson introduced the dimension a long time ago of save the Black colleges and made it a theme within the National Convention for several years of Operation Push. And that concept, that urgent necessity is perhaps more cutting in terms of necessity today than it was in the 70s when it was set forth. The Black Expo, which was a creative initiative of Breadbasket, is still alive, but the folk who are carrying it don't know where it came from, and it has another name. But that's all right. Blessings do not always carry the name of the author, but they're nevertheless blessings. And for instance, we draw from wells that we did not dig, and we eat from the fruit from trees that we did not plant. And that's what we are here for. And I simply want to say to each person on this panel, thank you, and a salute to Reverend Jackson, because he just won't quit. There's a poet who talks about how God works with us through the years, and humanity won't come right. But after a while, that writer says, "Dear God, how you must love your job. Teach me to love mine."
My God. Thank you so much for those comments. I tell you, I don't want to embarrass you, Reverend Moss, but I'm always so inspired by the profundity of your remarks that come so easily from the tip of your tongue. Thank you so much. And you've raised some really important points about how the efforts of Breadbasket, how the efforts of you all, you gave us this historical trajectory to bring us to this moment. We really appreciate that. And you're right, many people do not appreciate what happened with Dr. Martin Luther King when he was arrested that time in Atlanta, the story's not told about how they woke him in the middle of the night. The jailers took him out and put him in the car in the middle of the night, sitting next to a German Shepherd.
Yes.
For 2 hours out into the country, and for 2 hours he sat there with a German Shepherd next to him, thinking that he was going to be lynched for 2 hours.
You're right.
And that was such a hard. But now that story was so horrible. But what I draw from it is that in spite of that, he still, with that terrible fear of going to jail, that came out of that when he thought he was going to be lynched, and they took him out into the country, he was still able to go to lynch and go to jail with you all every time that was necessary.
They got him up at 4 a.m. in the morning, put chains on his body, and handcuffs, and the German police dog, and drove him across the state 230 miles, and then put him in solitary confinement. But guess what? He wrote a letter to Coretta, to Mrs. King, and one line in that letter he wrote, he said, "I have the faith to believe that the suffering coming to our family now will somehow make Atlanta a better city, Georgia a better state, and America a better nation."
Wow.
Just how, I do not yet know, but I have the faith to believe that it will.
My God, my God.
Oh,
We found that as foundational, that kind of sentiment was really foundational to the movement, wasn't it? You once told me that nonviolence is a way of life, not just a political practice, but a way of life, and that included redemptive suffering, would you say, as a foundation for what you all were doing?
Yes, you see, nonviolence will not keep you from getting killed. As a matter of fact, it can urge it on. Neither will the pork chop. Nonviolence will not keep you from being killed, but it will keep you from being a killer. It never was a safe path in life, but it is a saving path, and that makes the difference.
Well, you know, I just like to note that there's so much criticism of Black Lives Matter movement, but when we look at their website, they also say that they subscribe to nonviolent struggle, which comes directly out of the movement that so many of you gave your life.
And you know, when Richard Allen was pulled up from prayer in a predominantly white church and went out and founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church, he was saying Black lives, Black souls, and Black integrity matter.
Well, there you go.
Well, over Hendricks.
Yes, sir.
It seems to me that Dr. King, we say you act yourself in the way of thinking, think yourself in the way of acting. We act yourself in the way of thinking, and then you think yourself in the way of acting. I think that the tension that we had between us, frankly, between the private sector and the public sector, his vision was a job and income for everybody, and health insurance for everybody. But I was convinced that you had to mobilize the resources in the private sector to make it happen. So we went to Memphis, help the garbage workers, the sanitation workers. And then we had a standstill. I said, well, if we can get Coca-Cola and the major companies in Memphis to boycott them, they'll leverage the mayor. In his last speech, I remember he talked about my reference to boycott, because I've even leveraged it. I remember we were in our last session, we were arguing about going to Washington. Remember I said, well, if you get to Washington, and John said, what's the hook? What's the stick? And he couldn't figure it out. I said, well, suppose the top 50 model, we boycotted General Motors, then General Motors was the ultimate company at that. And leverage, so the dynamic between leverage in the private sector and public, he grew to appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
It was always his favorite reference, because frankly, we did things in the private sector that never happened before.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Reverend Morris, for sharing that those very profound thoughts and bringing it home to the.
Oh, but there's a picture somewhere where Dr. King came out of jail.
Huh?
One guy standing with a picket sign. One guy where Dr. King from jail.
Mm-hmm.
Those calls. There's a classic picture somewhere. Welcome Dr. King from jail.
I didn't get that, Reverend. You said what?
Dr. King came from jail. There's a classic picture something of Otis welcoming Dr. King.
Oh.
Yeah.
Classic picture.
Reverend Moss was working at Ebenezer. He knew Dr. King before Montgomery. He knew Dr. King before Montgomery. So the relationship runs a little deeper than 55.
See, he's in his humility, he has not even shared that. But thank you for sharing that. At this, one thing I would like you might take a moment. I've heard the name, and I'm sorry to say I'm not as familiar as I should be, Gary Masoni. I've heard Reverend Wallace mention it, and you, Reverend Jackson, and Reverend Terrell has spoken of him. Somebody, would you just give us a few words to those who aren't familiar with his role? Apparently he played a significant role early on. Would you just give us a thumbnail of Gary Masoni, who he was, and the role that he played, please?
Well, Jack and I got to Chicago in '64. We were unloading our luggage. Gary and his wife and Wallace and his wife, David. And our bands together. He was a Stanford graduate, very smart guy, a record keeper, and he was always there. And we hooked up a friendship. We went to Selma together. When I ran, first he became my schedule in the 1948 campaign. He was always there. And my God, when he died last year, it just took our hearts away. Gary and David and I, we were kind of a threesome. We used our seminary experience and knowledge of stuff to combine with other talents other people had. And he's a part of our threesome. Yeah.
Another relatively unsung hero, but not unsung. Thank you for sharing that, Reverend.
Dr. Hendricks?
At this point, yes.
His daughter and family are on the conference.
Oh.
Yes, they are.
Yes.
Yes, Gina Masoni is here with us. Thank you for joining us, Gina. So glad to have you. Is Mom present?
I believe so.
Hey, Betty.
I'm not sure if she has her sound on, but
okay.
Thank you so much for inviting us and for your documenting the history.
Thank you.
Yes, I would also. This is Betty, Gary's wife, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad to hear his name. I look forward to hearing more about the role that he played, because as I've said, and I think that Reverend Smith has indicated, this will not be the last of these kinds of sessions that we will be having in the future. We look to do more, and so we'll be looking at in more depth at the roles of folk involved. Thank you all.
Gary was my conscience and Ben was my chastiser.
Yeah, I'm sure you needed both of them too.
And another, excuse me, another person that we should talk about is Reverend Ed Riddick. In the next symposium, have to talk about his role in early Breadbasket.
Ed Riddick, okay. Thank you.
And Mrs. Sarah Pitcher.
Thank you. Thank you all. You know, in this moment in which we find ourselves, this is a very pivotal moment in the history of our country. Things are happening very quickly, and we have a confluence of things going on now with the COVID pandemic challenge, with this this new emphasis on police terrorism and brutality and murder of Black people. But it's really in the context, it's all happened so oddly enough in the context of this pandemic. And that's something that that has to be talked about if we talk about politics, and if we talk about talking about the contributions of Reverend Jesse Jackson. And I'd like to open up in a minute to just a discussion of what might be an effective theological response to evil in light of COVID. I mean, evil in terms of police terrorism. We've seen this upsurge of racism since really the beginning of the campaign of Donald Trump, but also the evil in the way that COVID has been ignored for some constituencies, and as a result, it's causing death to a greater degree in some of those constituencies, particularly African Americans. But I'd like to just share something with you. I'd like to just read something from an article, 1988 edition of the June 88 edition of the New York Times, from an article by Bernard Weintraub entitled "Jackson Calls for a National Health Care Plan." The Reverend Jesse Jackson today proposed a new direction in the nation's health system under which a single federally administered program would guarantee care to all Americans. Addressing the National Convention of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Reverend Jackson emphasized that his plan was, quote, universal, unquote, and would cover the estimated 37 million Americans who have no insurance and 35 million more who have such poor insurance, his words, that a serious sickness would disrupt them. Saying that the nation must rid itself of, quote, our wasteful public-private patchwork medical delivery system, unquote, Mr. Jackson proposed a federally administered, quote, national health program, unquote, in which hospitals and nursing homes no longer would charge individually for each patient in service. Instead, Mr. Jackson said, hospitals will negotiate an annual budget with a national health program based on the size and healthcare needs of the population it serves. Mr. Jackson said his plan would, quote, actually save money over the current system, unquote. He added, we'd be providing some $81 billion more in care, but saving $94 billion on bureaucracy, advertising, and excessive profits. Essentially, the program is intended to strip away government, corporate, and health insurance bureaucracies that deal with the current health system, Mr. Jackson said. He said trimming bureaucratic fat rather than adding massive new taxes would pay for much of the program, and that it would not limit healthcare choices. I have shared that with you all this morning as a point of entry into our discussion of what might be an effective response to this COVID, to the evil of COVID crisis. And when we speak of it in theological terms, Reverend Jackson, I think, has provided us, and not only did he provide in 88 an important model that if we were following now, there'd be tens of thousands of people still alive from COVID, but it's also a kind of the kind of approach from a biblical perspective that is based on loving our neighbor as ourselves and acknowledging everybody being born, being created with equal rights and equal rights to eat of the tree of the fruit of the tree of life. And that includes with health care. So in talking about how we might move forward, provide what might be a theological, an effective theological response to the evil that underlies our present challenges and malaise. I'd like to ask Dr. Terrell, Reverend Wilson, Reverend Moss, to join the discussion, to talk about a theological response. What might be the kind of response that we want to teach this nation in dealing with this COVID pandemic and in pandemic and in crises of this magnitude in the future?
Well, at the core, I think of prophetic ministry is help, healing, and wholeness. You cannot totally embrace the New Testament, faith, tradition, or the biblical, in my opinion, faith, tradition, and ignore the urgency of health, wholeness, health, healing, and wholeness. And until we make that a centerpiece of our national structure and commitment, as well as our institutions where we operate, we will be contributing to, on a daily basis, death and not life. I was sick, and you came unto me. Not based on what comprehensive medical care you were able to purchase because you were fortunate enough to be in an income bracket where you could meet the cost and have somebody else pay for it. It is shameful to see a government official receiving from us, the taxpayer, lifetime health benefits, and yet voting against his or her constituents receiving the same thing.
Yes. Reverend Dr. Terrell.
So as a theologian, I'm always concerned about the God concept that goes forth whenever there are crises that are afoot. And particularly in light of the predicaments we find ourselves facing today, the police brutality, COVID-19, and just the multitude of evil that's coming up out of the pit of hell to torture. So many people are saying God is using these things in order to bring us back to God. And I, for one, am a person who does not like to blame God for anything. I'm very Augustinian in that. I want to absolve God of anything that we can do, in any duty to do what we can do. I'd like to absolve God of that responsibility. So I never think in terms of a theodicy. Begins with the proposition, since or if God is good, then why does evil exist? I begin with anthropodicy to say, since God is good, to root myself in an unchangeable position that since God is good, why are people evil? Because every evil thing that we see in the world, we can find the human antecedents of it. It is not COVID-19 that's evil, it's the response to it that's evil.
Yes,
yes.
It's not, it's not a question that we don't need law and order. What we need is people who will be just in their application of the law. What we need is people. We need to defund the police in order to increase the capacity of our community to respond faithfully to the call of God to them to be full and contributing members of human society. We have to name stuff for what it is. We have to, just like Dolores Williams named what we experience as demonarchy, we need to understand that there is a hatred of Black people that is of biblical proportions. It's very similar to the hatred that Amnon had for his sister Tamar, whom he raped after he raped and left her desolate. That is how we are as Black people. We are the Tamars in the story. We are left desolate and have to struggle to find subversive joy in our lives. And in order to push for the renewed world that God continuously asks us to be part of that agenda. So I'm certain that our response to evil in the current context has to be that we are truly honoring of the God we say we serve.
yes.
And by becoming the people of God, the beloved community, by being audacious enough to face down the demons, being courageous enough to speak our truth, just being as womanish as we possibly can be as people, meaning that we're holistic in our approach to the survival and wholeness of not only our community, but the universal community as well. The beautiful thing, Black womanist theology, is that the self-love it counsels is reflexive, and it is generative. It goes to others, but yet there is no true universality without an emphasis on one's particularity as well. So that's how we get to the renewed world. When people really think about what kind of stakes we have in each other.
And in the common good. Yeah, you know, I'm with you, Dr. Terrell, because I mean, one thing, I just have to note, one thing implicit in your remarks with regard to the Black church is a challenge and an indictment. A challenge and an indictment of the roles the church should be playing and the role that the church is not playing. Because I think that there is, you know, we all talk about we quote, without vision, the people perish. I think what we are missing in the church today is a holistic vision of the role the church is supposed to play. You know, Jesus didn't tell us to worship him, he said to follow him. And that has to do with our actions in the world and not just so much what goes on Sunday morning. But I like to offer that to approach this, the evil that has been uncovered in this COVID moment. We have to become clear, I think, as people of biblical faith, what is the core of the gospel? and what are the basic principles that should move us in this moment. And one thing to recognize is that the foremost ethical concept in the Bible is the term mishpat, or justice. And it has a number of nuances and a number of different forms. The word itself does. For instance, mishpatim, we translate that as Judges, Book of Judges. It really means those who do justice. But the importance of justice is, biblical justice is that it's egalitarian fundamentally, as evidenced in the term, the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. Means we must want the same for our neighbors as we want for ourselves and our loved ones. And so there's so much in the Bible that people can have and that they can point to. Some of it seems to be contradictory and is contradictory, and some of it points in all kinds of directions. That's why we have to focus in on what is our vision? What is the core of our understanding of our approach? I like to offer, number one, that our approach must be a holistic approach. And that's one of the things I've noticed in Reverend Jackson's work. His approach has always been holistic, and that is to say, and Jesus laid it out for us. He took a verse from Deuteronomy that says, love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which is a vertical axis. And he added to that a verse from Leviticus that says, love your neighbor as yourself. We notice you cannot have a cross without both axes, but also where they meet there is what we might call holistic spirituality, holistic approach to the world. So spirituality has to have an activist component based on our ethics. And our ethics are love your neighbor as yourself, I'm suggesting, but also Matthew 25, that was mentioned by Reverend Moss earlier. Love as you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. As you have not done it to the least of these, you have not done it unto me. That has to do with Jesus is saying that, and this is the foremost mode of judgment that Jesus gives us, Matthew 25, 31 through 46. And that this mode of judgment is the judgment by which the church and those of us who are believers must judge our actions, and not about who's sleeping with who and or any of those extraneous things, but whether you're trying to help somebody and love somebody. Now with the church, the involvement of the church has to be based on that. Are we trying to serve? And in this moment, in this COVID moment, we must look and we must exhort our churches to become more deeply involved on a practical level. That's with testing and giving out masks and all that, with a prescriptive level, which means that we must insist that our authorities do a much better job in handling this, and that we insist that folks stand up, and our churches should be picketing and protesting very hard against those who are telling people you don't need masks, or this is not such a dangerous moment. Prescriptively, we need to be prescribing what these folks are supposed to do. And last, there should be an analytical component. And we see this with what Reverend Jackson has done. He's prescribed policies, but there's always been this heavy analytical moment. And we need to analyze what's going on and why it's going on, why it's spreading in our communities, and what we can do to stop it. And that is one of the strengths, I think, of Reverend Jackson's work. And one of the things that has always struck me in our conversations, and I remember I ran to Al Sharpton a couple of years ago, and he said, one of the weakest points in our movement is lack of analysis. Well, Jesse Jackson has always modeled the importance of analysis. So if we talk about evil in this moment, we have to analyze what really is the nature of the evil. And lastly, let me say this. When we talk about the nature of the evil that has folk dying from COVID who don't need to die, then we must look at what is the nature of evil. Now, there's a lot of misunderstandings about the Bible, and a lot of misunderstandings about the book of Revelation. But one thing is the book of Revelation never spoke about an antichrist. It talked about a beast. It did not, we see in the Johannine letters that talks about the antichrist, and it didn't talk about antichrist as some metaphysical supernatural being. It talked about those who taught the opposite of what Christ taught and what Christ was, taught that in the name of Jesus. In other words, it was antichrist because it taught the opposite. It turned people to the opposite, turned people away from Jesus' teachings into in the name of Jesus' teaching. At that time, it was saying that Jesus didn't die on the cross. It was some kind of apparition, which really took all of the power of the cross out of the gospel. At this moment, we have, in the Johannine gospel letters also talk about a spirit of antichrist. I'd like to offer that we are in a moment of antichrist right now, antichrist sentiment, meaning that we have folk who are teaching, who our president has imbued our country with a spirit of antichrist, in that he has folk embracing evil and hatred and marginalization and racism in the name of Christ. What Jesus said is right, they're now saying is wrong. And what Jesus said was wrong, they're now saying is right. I mention this because if we start looking at, in our analysis, that there is this spirit of antichrist that underlies so much of what's going on now, that is one way that we can identify the evil that's going on now, not just the incompetence, but the evil that has taken over this country, and that is resulting in so much death, not only from police, but from this whole COVID pandemic, where people are dying that don't need to die.
Dr. Hendricks.
Yes, sir.
One of the challenges that we have is humility. Arrogance and pride precede the fall.
Mm-hmm.
God didn't just call preachers in pulpits, and he didn't just call the church, he called almost a God. So you look at one day and we buried the biggest military in the world, big budget and all that. And God lets loose a germ out of China. And God called scientists, he called scientists to preach too. And we ignored the science and chose the superstition. And we chose politics over the science, ignoring God's science preachers. Paying a big price for that. The other thing I'm concerned about here is that a germ can make the military be still. I mean, bombs can't stop the COVID-19. Ships can't stop. Those other ships catch COVID-19. How a germ, an unchecked germ, can make the Western world stand still. Just a germ, not political opposition. On the other hand, I'm concerned that we look at George Floyd's death.
Yes.
You know, pneuma, breath in the Old New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
As his breath left, he breathed life into the world. This is not some theologian, not some preacher of a big church. It's a common guy who his death has brought life to the whole world. George Floyd, the germ, COVID-19, has made the mighty humble and made the empowered humble. All of a sudden now, these soldiers, we need nurses and doctors, not planes and bombs, but you need vaccines. Somewhere I read, swords and plowshares, spears and pruning hooks. The time we spend with swords and spears, it's not the best use of our time. I went to South Africa some years ago, 1979, with Dr. Shomer, CTS. He'd been an official of the Council Church. He got us into South Africa, Jack out some kind of way. And I got to the airport. I was naive enough to think I'd kind of ease in, cameras everywhere. So why are you here? I said, I'm here to see South Africa for myself. Why are you here? We have friends. Said, why do you have churches here? What about I said, well, I believe human rights for all human beings, measure human rights by 1 yardstick. That's it. I believe human rights by 1 yardstick for all human beings was like a threat to that system. And today, human rights by 1 yardstick is the measure.
Yes.
And I look at this, you have the code 19, code blue, poverty, and runaway president at the same time. It's enough to make the humble, make the mighty humble, make the arrogance leave us, because what we need is what the military does not have to offer us. We need something else. And I would like to think that the God factor in this is that it forces all Prince Charles behind the gates can't duck it. Boris Johnson and Britain can't stop it. That's a way of making the mighty humble and getting our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is such a terrible moment. Reverend Wallace, did you want to share a comment?
Yes, I think what you have unleashed this morning is a great discussion that is very clear. It should not stop. This discussion should continue. And I want to thank you for it. Not only looking at Reverend Jackson's productivity over 5 decades, but as a means of taking an institution like Chicago Theological Seminary and preparing students, laymen, a community with the background and purpose to serve in what's called ministry activism. And not only is that discussion taking place on the screen, there's been quite a discussion in the chat box too. And that I see this is being recorded, and hopefully it will be shared around many places. But we need to provide a coherent academic background with a purpose to serve in ministry activism. We need to grasp the gospel that is meant, that has meat and methods to serve in the United States and around the world, reaching unreached people groups in various parts of the world. No one can duplicate the energy that Jesse Jackson has unleashed on this world. Those of us who've tried to keep up with him find that we burn out because this man has more energy than we know what to do with, and we praise the Lord and thank the Lord for that. However, his persistence, his commitment to justice, and that there is no gap between Jesus and justice. His understanding, his desire to heal brokenness needs to challenge all of us and perhaps be incorporated in any kind of instruction at CTS and CTS's programs. Commitment of the institution with the staff and research and other resources, including internships. Internships were helpful to us. The commitment of hiring and sending institutions, be it the various congregations, United Church of Christ, the Methodist, Disciples of Christ, the National Baptist Convention, all those different kinds of sending institutions having the relationship with CTS is going to be powerful. And looking at the resources such as ideas, encouragement, funds, counsel, accountability. All of these should hopefully will go into such a program. And thank you for having this. Thank you, CTS. Thank you for Brian Smith, for you, Dr. Hendricks, and all those who've participated today. Thank you for including me. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you so much. That's such an elegant way to as we move toward the close of our program. Such an elegant way, an eloquent way for you to put that, because there is so much more. You talk about a 50-year career, as you did, and the amount of energy and commitment and accomplishment, which we have not even begun to scratch the surface of today. It is worthy of academic study and inspiring. I will say this. I invited Reverend Jackson I teach at Columbia University, and I invited him to come to speak to a couple classes, and also to do a major public conversation with Cornel West. He went, and some of these students, the students are young, 18 years old and all that. They have no idea of the kinds of things Reverend Jackson did decades ago, and of his stature, really. But they sat spellbound listening to him. And we went to one class, which was a class about activism. Reverend Jackson will remember that. That's what the class was about. And these young people were the activists on campus. I mean, they were really, politically well versed. They had read Foucault and Derrida, and they read Fanon and all that. When Reverend Jackson spoke, they were spellbound. And when they left, after he left, the teacher told me that for weeks afterward, the students were discussing the things he taught them. Then, when he spoke in the public dialogue with Cornel West, many of the students, again, did not know much about him. But when he was through speaking, I heard so much from these students for weeks on end. They got a lesson in activism that they did not know, some of the nuances of it that they did not know. And so this shows how really important this kind of academic study would be for this generation and generations to come, and also for older generations. A lot of folk don't really know the full gamut of the things that he has done. So I want to thank you for raising that. And I know we're moving toward the end. I didn't want to overlook Dr. Jeanette Wilson. If you wanted to make a comment on the COVID-19 or on police brutality, or a sort of a closing comment.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hendricks, and thank you, Dr. Ray and Reverend Brian Smith, and most of all, Reverend Jackson. I think that he causes us to move outside of the academy and outside of our buildings. He being Reverend Jackson, his model is really a Jesus model. Once you have the theological frame of reference and some of the understandings, I think that as we look at hatred and this violence, this racism, it is moving past the analysis of what it is to understand and how do you treat a disease that has systematically been in existence over a period of years and decades. And so one of the things that I've learned from Reverend is, and the same thing that Jesus did, you must go to the place. If you watch him, every time there's been a crisis in our history, in our lifetime, working with him and watching him, he goes to the problem. He goes to the source, understanding. He's already made some analysis. He's convened experts to share with him information. And then he seeks to coordinate resources so that you can change the condition of those people in that situation as a model for how they can change a city, a country, and a nation. It's almost like when Jesus took the disciples on a boat from a storm to the meet the man in the Gadarenes. Here's a man bruising himself, cutting himself, been put out of any system of support, living among the dead. And Jesus goes and deals with the economic structures that existed in that place, the Gadarenes, where they were, raising hogs for a profit. And he deals with the economic challenges, which is why they wanted him to go. Reverend Jackson has always had a tension between the economic, the political, and the spiritual, challenging us to go counterculture, to address the systemic problems and not focus on, the man Gadarenes was acting crazy, could have been a drug addict, could have been a lot of things. Let's deal with the system that causes him. Let's deal with the people that put him out of the town and would not give him the care he needs. And so I think seminary, this program has to also have an immersion component. You can't teach where you haven't been. You cannot understand where you have not gone. That's why they went to Selma. So then they could understand theologically, what is God saying? You don't really hear him when you're sitting in a room reading a book. Yeah, I think. Yeah, so I am excited about this. I think this has great potential. Yeah,
if you mean the thought of maybe one day doing a academic
plunge.
Yeah, no, I think thank you. Your comments are just right on time. I'd like to make a comment and then give Reverend Jackson a closing comment and then turn it on over to Brian Smith. Let me say first, you all have been a wonderful panel. I've learned so much from listening to you and been so inspired by all that I've heard. But I'd just like to share this. I came across an article recently in the Journal of Economic and Social Thought by a scholar by the name of Enrico Bertramini. And the name of the title of the article was, in the Journal of Economic and Social Thought, was entitled Race, Capitalism, and Power, the Economic Thought of the Young Jesse Jackson. What that says is that there is, and we're talking about the Journal of Economic and Social Thought. What that says is that there is such a depth and breadth of the activism, the thought, the modeling, the accomplishments, both domestic and international, of Reverend Jesse Jackson, that it's almost calls out for us to continue and to do a deeper study, not just for academic reasons like Dr. Wilson was saying, but because of the great contribution it would make to empowering the struggle and those who engage in it. And so for me, this has been a great gathering of great minds and thought, inspired by one of great minds and thought, great minds and thinkers. And I look forward to us doing more. For my part, I'm going to continue doing more and more study of Reverend Jackson's record and his accomplishments and his brilliant thought. And I look forward to it becoming in the future a bigger and bigger part of our study. And at Columbia University, our program just became Department of African American and African Diasporic Studies. We have our own department with our own endowed chairs. And these are the kinds of studies, kinds of programs and classes we like to see in our program and many similar programs across the country. So thank you all very much. Reverend Jackson, we'd like to get a final word from you, if you would, and then we'll have Brian Smith close us out. Reverend? You're muted, Reverend. Reverend Jackson, you're muted. You're on mute. Someone unmute him, please. Reverend, it looks like you're on mute. Are you able to hear me? If you're able to hear me, please, whoever's standing there, take him off mute, please. Okay, thank you. There you are. We hear you now.
I want to thank you, Dr. Overhead. You mean so much to me. Politics of Jesus, I wish I had read it when I was in seminary. It's such a profound analysis of how we read Jesus, reality versus Jesus of the 300, not seeing Jesus. You gotta, I learned so much from that. Thank you so much. Betty and Gina, love you guys so much. Let me make this point, Reverend. Rainbow Push, we are really a part of my unfinished seminary project. I'm here carrying out my seminary work. This is how to think systematically. And God can take street language, crooked stick into the straight lick. God can use evil and death to bring about life and good. There's nothing too hard for God. I believe that. Another thing that I'm really convinced of as I look at this panel today is what do we read today? We're celebrating Juneteenth. Part of the analysis part of it is that they want the emancipation, Dred Scott, 1857. 1863, Lincoln said, if you don't end the war and rejoin you, I'll even have to free them, I'll do it. Now, watch this. 6 years after Dred Scott, Lincoln gives a challenge in the fall. Some people look at this cynically. And he said to the South, you cannot survive without these slaves. If I have to free them, I'll free them. And we started praying 100 days ago. Christmas had been nothing else, so we couldn't shop, had no money. December 31st became the first watch night. We watched all night, we prayed all night long, we watched and prayed. And so, Emancipation Proclamation. I urge those who march on the day for Juneteenth, don't miss Emancipation Proclamation. It's a serious document. The first time we were citizens 6 years after Dred Scott. We were citizens. We had first time we could bear arms against our oppressor. If you read that document, if you leave the presentation, try to stop you, you can shoot them. 200,000 blacks joined the Union Army. Lincoln freed us. We saved Lincoln. We saved the Union. The South would have won that war. We saved the Union, saved Lincoln, and he freed us. That was the deal. Now, let me tell you this. Juneteenth, 1865. I want all of you to please read the Emancipation Proclamation. Read it one more time today. Here, you have the right. You can arm. You can drive vessels. He empowered us militarily, to fight for our freedom and to fight to save the country. Now, what I'm concerned about now is that Juneteenth is like a day it ended. It really didn't end. 13th Amendment had holes in it. One was everybody free except prisoners. The South took that to mean they could take all unemployed blacks and put them on prison farms and go to prison, parchment. So slavery really didn't end. Also, there's a ship called the Clotilda in Mobile, Alabama, 1869, 4 years after Galveston. You're still smuggling Africans into the country. The last ship was Clotilda in Mobile. Why am I saying this? Because part of it, you can't teach what you don't know. You can't leave. You got to have some knowledge, some commitment to research what's happening. If you're marching there for Juneteenth, and you miss Clotilda in Mobile, you're missing something. If you Juneteenth and miss Emancipation, that's a very tight document. Whereas on this day, you'll be set free. Now, all those he could set free on that day. See, even as we did with Juneteenth, Emancipation Proclamation, Clotilda, that's part of our work today. I leave this with you, my brothers and my sisters. I am rather convinced nothing is too hard for God. And the key remains what it always was. If my people will call my name, well, I'm going to say, and pray. And seek you may never see God's face, just seeking it is the right direction. And if you seek it, just try and do the right thing. Make your goals redemptive. When I brought Goodman home from Syria, Reagan said, don't go. If you do go, you mess up, you'll be charged. If you get him, bring him back. I brought him back to the White House, you mentioned that. And Reagan said, Reverend Jackson, I can't argue with success. What can we give you? He had his whole cabinet in the Roosevelt room. I said, well, what you can do for me is call aside and say thank you. Now, that was a hard thing to ask him to do. They called aside. He talked aside, and they never stopped talking.
He called aside?
He called him right there, and they never stopped communicating. My goal was redemptive. I mean, he said, what can I do for you? As in grant, do something. Say thank you to the guy that you dismissed as your enemy. He said thank you, and then they talked, and they never stopped talking. In all the movements, we've sought to remain redemptive, to renew our faith and our spirits. I'm indebted to CTS. I went to CTS, Brian Smith, with Jesus in my pocket. Jesus followed me, which is not a very long distance. Now I follow Jesus because he takes me in all these strange places, you know what I mean? Where my land, I'm at home. Where my land? Because he's already there. And the principles of Jesus, to me, have broad practical application.
Yes,
I don't love Jesus because I'm scared I might go to hell or might go to heaven. I love Jesus for practical reasons. See me the art of survival, follow his philosophy, how he sees God. And again, I want to thank Jeanette and all our staff members who work with us every day here. And I look forward to working more, Brian, with CTA in the future, because we have this day we're marching, and I'm marching, they end police brutality. Police brutality is the surface level. It's the epidermis of our struggle.
Yes, sir.
These are public workers, low-paid public workers, middle-class workers who got a gun to badge, more power than they should have. But when you remove police, they don't have the power. Police, how can I put this thing, Reverend? I'll let you. The police, they patrol. They don't have control. Who has control is in the NFL from 33 to 45 wouldn't let blacks play in the NFL.
Yeah, that's right.
That wasn't police. That wasn't police. Banks will not lend, not invest. 80% of the black folks in Louisville don't have internet. That's not about police. Or the bound in poverty, the gap between the surplus and the deficit culture. So I don't want all of it just look at bad police. We should civilize them. Remember about freedom of our lives, not our equality of our lives. Those are markers because George Floyd, not marshals for economic justice. And so we fight for economic justice, we fight for peace. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brother Hendricks.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Reverend. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Brother Smith.
Thank you all who participated, all those who joined in our call, all those who were speakers. I just want to say this is just the beginning. The best is yet to come. And now we'll hear from our president, Dr. Stephen Ray.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Well, I too would like to offer a word of thanks for each of you as you've come to be with us. I just want to make one very, very quick comment about one dimension of Reverend's work that we should all take note of, and that is that when you strike a match, you never know where the flame will go. He had no idea 32 years ago when he was introduced to the youth minister at Horace Bushnell Congregational Church, who his classmate, Mark Welch, was the pastor of, would this many years later be the president of his alum, his alma mater. And be organizing this particular event. So this event has its origins 32 years ago when Reverend Jackson was running for office and I worked on his campaign. And Reverend Mark Welch had him come to our church. And I had the opportunity to meet him and be in awe of him ever since. So I don't want us to lose that one of the great witnesses of his work is that if you simply light a match, you have no idea where the flame is going to go.
Great.
Having said that, once again, I want to thank each and every one of you for being with us and express our deep gratitude to all of our guests who joined us. And I'd now like to ask Dr. Terrell if she would give us a closing prayer.
Let us pray. In the name of the cannot be named, in the name of freedom and justice, in the name of love that must be shared in order to be real. In the name of the goodness with which we were created, and in which God, behold us, your creation, your loved creation. Be with us in this time of crisis upon crisis. Be with us as we learn to frame things critically with our minds and to respond to the horrors of this moment with courage, with faith, with confidence. That you guide us, you will help us, you will go with us to the places we need to go. Guide our feet while we run this road. Hold our hands. Wash our hearts. Keep our hope alive. Bless all who are under the sound of my voice, and especially now, bless Reverend Jackson, that this work that you have begun in him will go forth again and again through him and through our hands, through our minds, through our advocacy, through our work. Thank you for this time together. Thank you for the will to move forward. Thank you for subversive joy. Thank you for your goodness to us. And we pray all of these things in the name of the one who called us, in your many and glorious names, in the name of Jesus. Amen and Ashe.
Amen. Ashe.
Go in peace.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Over.
This staff meeting, you need to prepare for this Cubs thing.
Reverend is active man, bless his heart.
Okay, you all take care. Thank you all so much. This has been a wonderful opportunity. So Brian, I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Okay.
Bless you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.